In August 1590, a pirate ship, the Hopewell, landed off the coast of modern-day Outer Banks in North Carolina. Traveling among the pirates, one supply chest to his name, was Englishman John White, who was a prolific artist, cartographer, and voyager to the Americas. The last time White had laid eyes on this shore was 3 years prior. The ocean had not been welcoming to the crew, as they were greeted by a hurricane and had to fight their way to the island they sought. Now, the seas were calmer, and so was White. He couldn't help feeling optimistic. The crew had seen smoke rising from somewhere on the island, which was a good sign. A couple of days later, White and the others trekked inland. The heat and humidity had them sweating before long, but they persisted. White in particular. He had a personal stake in this mission, you see. Finding his wife and daughter, his son-in-law and granddaughter. The first English child to be born in the New World. If his family were still alive on the island, he would find them. Finally, the settlement came into view. White remembered when he first spotted this fort way back in 1587. The dilapidated wooden structures were a far cry from the creature comforts of home. But neither he nor the colonists he traveled with had been afraid of hard work. They had understood the risks and challenges that they would face in the New World. At least, they thought they had. But the sight of the empty fort, just as forgotten and lonely as when White had first seen it, felt goosebumps creep up and down his forearms, in spite of the summer heat. He used to pray each night of the last long 3 years that a prosperous colony would be waiting for him. Instead, what lay before him was a ghost town. Not a trace of settlers was left behind. Well, that wasn't quite true. Carved into a palisade at the front of the wooden fort was a singular word: Croatoan. John ran his fingers along the crude curves of the letters, needing his tactile proof of the colonists' existence. How long had the settlers been gone? And what caused their demise? 115 souls vanished, lost to the unforgiven lands of the New World. Roanoke is the oldest English colony in the United States, and it's also the site of one of the nation's oldest mysteries. There's more to this story than a word in an abandoned fort, however. In this episode, we will dive deep into this mystery, the facts, theories, the major players to get a better sense of what really happened at Roanoke, the lost colony. My name is Edwin, and here is a dark memory. The first historical record of John White is in 1577. John sailed to the Americas on a mission in search of precious metals and passage to Asia, neither of which were found. After that, John takes a backseat in this tale until 1587. In the meantime, Sir Walter Raleigh takes center stage. Raleigh had skyrocketed up the social ladder in Queen Elizabeth's court. His popularity with the Queen made him an enemy of her closest advisor, Sir Francis Walsingham. Additionally, Raleigh snagged the Queen's blessing to send an expedition to the New World to scout territory for a colony, a blessing coveted by Walsingham. Crossing the Queen's advisor would come back to haunt the colonists of Roanoke, the island that Raleigh chose to stake his claim. The initial expedition to the island only lasted a few weeks, focusing on reconnaissance and relations with the local tribes. 2 Native Americans, Mateo and Wanchese, accompanied the voyagers back to England and were used to endorse the land the British called Virginia. It's a good place for a permanent colony. In 1585, 600 military personnel sailed back to Roanoke, led by Raleigh's cousin, Sir Richard Grenville. Only 200 arrived, however, and their food ship was destroyed en route. It's unclear whether routine danger or sabotage are to blame, as one of the ship's captains was a former pirate named Simon Fernandez, who had been rescued from the gallows by none other than Walsingham, which indebted Fernandez to his service. He was known as Walsingham's Man, and he was a definite source of trouble for Roanoke's colonists later on. But back to 1585. The English set up a fort, the foundation of the first colony of Roanoke Island. Wanchese disassociated himself from the English on account of one of the officers on the voyage killing about 20 members of a local tribe. But Manteo stayed with the crew, serving as an interpreter when they interacted with other Native Americans on the island. The colonists were granted permission to stay on the island for the winter from a chief named Wingina, who was the leader of a village of the island and another on the mainland. Wingina's only condition was that the English not petition the Native Americans for help getting through the winter. Despite Manteo's friendliness toward the English, tensions between the colonists and the islanders ran high. When the soldiers first arrived in 1585, they visited a few Native American villages with Manteo. On one trip, they discovered a missing silver chalice. Believing that the members of the Aquascagoke village stole it from them, they retaliated by burning down the village. The following June, Governor Ralph Lane led another unprovoked attack on Dasamanquepilk, Wingina's village on the mainland. At this point, Manteo's village was the only one still on good terms with the English colonists. In that same June, a supply ship arrived at Roanoke. Most of the supplies were lost in a hurricane. Instead, the ship collected the settlers and Manteo and transported them back to England. Unfortunately, 3 men were left on the island, with no way home and no idea when a friendly ship would come by to rescue them. These 3 men are the first lost colonists of Roanoke. Coincidentally, a supply ship sent by Raleigh showed up on the island shortly after. This one was captained by Richard Grenville, who had left Lane in charge of the previous year and returned to England. Grenville dropped off 15 men to hold down the fort, so to speak, and these men would become known as Grenville 15. In 1587, the second colony of Roanoke began to take shape. Raleigh appointed John White, the governor of the new colony, which he dubbed the City of Raleigh. The new colonists were men, women, and children who were looking to become landowners in the New World. Although life was difficult in the Americas, the hardships were worth it for many European settlers who had little money or prospects back home. This new crop of settlers left for the New World on April 26th, arriving at Roanoke Island on July 22nd. The last days that followed, John led a search party to find the Grenville 15 to find the fort built by the first colonists on the island. The latter search was fruitful. The former, less so. One skeleton was found, leading the settlers to assume that hostile islanders killed the Englishmen. As for the fort, the 2 years since it had been occupied had taken a toll, so John tasked the colonists with rebuilding existing structures, as well as building new ones. The colonists spent a few days at the end of July and the beginning of August hanging out with Manteo's people. The villagers informed the colonists that their English brethren, the Grenville 15, had been attacked by Native Americans from Wingina's villages. 2 died in the attack, and the rest escaped to a little island off of Roanoke's neighbor, Hatteras Island. They hadn't been heard from since. The colonists didn't anticipate running into Wingina's men, for they weren't meant to stay on Roanoke. Raleigh had actually instructed them to settle farther north, on the Chesapeake Bay. Their stay on Roanoke Island was supposed to be a pit stop to return Manteo to his village and to rescue the Grenville 15. But for most of the colonists, Roanoke Island would be their final destination. Remember Walsingham's man, Simon Fernandez? He'd captained one of the ships that transported the colonists to Roanoke in 1587. When the settlers had gotten on shore, Fernandez announced his intention of returning to England, stranding the settlers on Roanoke Island. With supply ships on their way to the Chesapeake Bay and hostile Native Americans in the area, leaving the English there would be sentencing them to certain death. Fernandez did allow Governor John White to accompany him back to England for supplies. But little did John know that he would never see those colonists ever again. The supply trip was slow going. Not only did John White arrive home weeks behind schedule, but his ship docked in Ireland first, in October. And he didn't reach Ireland until early November, which is too late in the year to send a ship back across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, Fernandez informed Raleigh that the expedition had indeed made it to Chesapeake, further condemning the colonists trapped on Roanoke Island. And to make matters worse, the conflict between England and Spain led Queen Elizabeth to confine all ships at home that October. They were to be used as defense against the Spanish Navy. It wasn't until March of the following year that she granted Richard Grenville permission to send a supply ship to Roanoke. However, Walsingham convinced the Queen to revoke that permission due to rumors that Spain was preparing to attack. Luckily for Walsingham, a lunar eclipse coinciding with an alleged earthquake announced certain doom to the superstitious Queen, strengthening his case to protect the home front at the expense of the trapped colonists. 2 years of war-induced gridlock later, Raleigh was finally given permission to send a single supply ship to Roanoke. The only ship he was able to hire was the Hopewell. The ship arrived at Roanoke in mid-August, almost exactly 3 years after John White had said goodbye to his friends and family for the last time. Now, there are several theories to account for what happened to the colonists that John left behind. Some believe they were kidnapped and/or killed by Native Americans. Back in 1587, while the colonists were staying at the fort, Wangina's men murdered one of the settlers, a man named George Howie. To avenge George, John led a nighttime attack on the Native Americans. Instead of Wangina's men, however, they accidentally attacked Manteo's people, the Croatoans. Wangina's men must have anticipated that the English would retaliate, so they relocated further inland. The Croatoans had been at the abandoned village, scavenging, when White and the others attacked. It's a strong possibility that a direct, perhaps accidental attack marked the limit of the Croatoans' kindness toward the English. Perhaps they even teamed up with Wangina's men to massacre the colonists. According to his diary entries, John was originally convinced that the colonists had carved the word Croatoan and the letter C-R-O themselves as an indication that they were joining Manteo's tribe. Their exploration of the abandoned forts revealed that 5 chests, which the colonists had hidden, were ransacked. John concluded that Wangina's men were to blame. Convinced of the colonists' safety with the Croatoans, the crew of the Hopewell continued south to gather more supplies before circling back around to Roanoke. Before heading south, the crew planned to travel inland once more to drop off some fresh water for the colonists. But they ran into some complications, including the loss of one of their anchors and the freshwater supply they planned to give to the colonists. Yet again, crucial supplies were lost off the shores of Roanoke Island. Up next, we'll keep looking at some of the theories, including some of the stranger ones, of what could have happened to the Roanoke settlers. After the crucial supplies were lost, curiously, White's diary has no mention of Roanoke. The remaining entries from August recount the Hopewell's travels in the West Indies, and then it skips to October. The last entry is from October 24th, 1590, when White returned to England. But why the time skip? The Hopewell must not have returned to Roanoke, or White surely would have documented his reunion with the colonists. For reasons unknown, Governor John White abandoned his colony a second time. Another theory is that the Spanish invaded the Roanoke colony and killed the English settlers. As previously mentioned, the English and Spanish were fierce enemies at the time. Roanoke was England's first attempt at a permanent settlement in the Americas. For the Spanish were the dominant European power. They might have seen Roanoke as people trying to take some spots in their territory. Aside from the general hostility toward the English, they might have had a particular grudge against the Roanoke colonists, since Richard Grenville captured a Spanish ship on his way back to England in 1585. There is a record of Spanish naval captain Vicente Gonzalez stopping at Roanoke in 1588. Spaniards found a deserted fort, meaning that the colonists were already gone long before White returned 2 years later. It's likely that if another Spanish crew had reached Roanoke before Gonzalez, there would be documentation. Maybe their goal was for the colonists to disappear quietly. Who knows? A third theory is that the colonists attempted to sail back to England but died at sea, which is highly unlikely. If what the Croatoans told White and the other colonists about the members of the Grenville 15 who escaped the island is true, then it's not impossible that the colonists White left at Roanoke would have followed the same path. However, the likelihood of this being what happened is extremely low. First, the colonists would have had to build a boat that would fit all 115 of them. And even before that, the colonists would have had to make the conscious decision to face the perils of the open ocean for a months-long journey on the limited food rations that they had with them. The fourth theory is that the colonists simply decided to migrate further inland, which would explain the empty fort. White made a pact with the colonists before he left, agreeing that if they were to move from the settlement, they should carve the relocation in an obvious spot. And the letters CRO make this theory plausible. However, the simple fact that there is no record of White finding the colonists' new settlement debunks this theory. For centuries, the answer to the disappearance of the colony of Roanoke was largely speculative. Yet in 2007, a team of researchers set out to use modern DNA science to solve the mystery. The Lost Colony DNA Project examines 3 types of DNA: Y-DNA, which is traceable through a male line; autosomal DNA, which utilizes all of a person's chromosomes to identify cousins; and mitochondrial DNA, which is passed from mothers to their kids and is traceable through a female line. Using historical records of surnames present at Roanoke, their goal is to identify living descendants of Roanoke's colonists in both the European American and Native American populations of North Carolina. This project, specifically the Lost Colony Y-DNA project, is ongoing. Maybe with enough participants in the project, these researchers will be closer to finding an answer to the question of Roanoke. But what if there isn't a logical explanation for the colonists' disappearance? Each theory we've examined has holes and reasons why they're not quite right. So what if a darker, more supernatural force had a hand in the mysterious vanishing? Given all the research on the colony of Roanoke, it's tempting to conclude that the island is cursed. 2 failed colonies, 4 destroyed supply stores in as many voyages, 115 lost colonists, more if you count the Grenville 15 and the 3 forgotten men from the 1586 supply run. Can we chalk all of that up to bad luck? Or was there something else going on Roanoke Island? There might be more to the word Croatoan. The word has been connected to other disappearances throughout history. For example, Edgar Allan Poe's death certificate and medical records disappeared, so the circumstances of his death are unconfirmed. And it's been said that Croatoan was one of the famous poets' last words. Croatoan is implicated in the disappearances of pilot Amelia Earhart and 19th century stagecoach robber Black Bart, too. Earhart wrote the word in her journal, and Bart carved it inside his prison cell. A horror writer named Ambrose Bierce slept in a bed with a Croatoan word carved into it, then disappeared shortly after. If all those examples are too coincidental for you, there's also the case of the Carroll A. Deering shipwreck. The vessel crashed on the Hatteras Island. No crew was on board. There was a logbook with Croatoan written on the final page. Tribes native to modern-day North Carolina have folklore that could also account for the colonists' disappearance. These tales range from witches wielding dark magic to a host of violent spirits. For instance, the Wendigo is a creature that takes over bodies of cannibals. Some theorize that the colonists would have chosen cannibalism before succumbing to starvation. Another evil spirit, reptilian devil of the woods, possesses people and brings out the worst qualities of human nature. A third spirit can absorb humans into the ground beneath their feet. And if these tales are true, the colonists may have become prey to the supernatural forces of lore. Of course, there's the ever-popular scapegoat for mysteries: aliens. One of the most chilling parts of the Roanoke mystery is the fate of little Virginia Dare. There's a legend surrounding the first English child born in the Americas. The legend of the White Doe. Now, the story begins with an attack by Wanchese, the other Native American who traveled to England with Raleigh's first expedition. Montejo saved the Dare family, but sadly, the parents died soon after. Montejo's village raised her and renamed her Winona. When she grew up, a witch doctor named Chico tried to win her affections, but she rejected him in favor of a man named Oquisco. Jealous and enraged, Chico transformed her into a white doe. In order to save Winona, Oquisco visited a rival witch doctor who gave Oquisco a magic arrow that would transform the doe back into a woman. The arrow pierced her heart. He managed to track down the doe and shoot her. However, Wanchese had managed to shoot a regular arrow in her heart at the same time. The doe was transformed back into a human, but she died instantly. Oquisco buried Winona at the old Roanoke colony. Hunters and residents of Roanoke Island have claimed to see an apparition of a white deer, believing it's the restless spirit of Virginia Dare. The mystery of the Roanoke colony is endlessly fascinating. It sends shivers up my spine thinking about the myriad of possible fates of the lost colonists. This mystery has reached legendary status for many Americans. The thing about legends, though, is that they never quite feel real. Today, Roanoke Island is home to about 6,000 residents and caters to tourists' taste for the unexplainable. It's home to the Lost Colony stage show, a performance about the Roanoke colony that can be seen all summer long. Like most historical sites, you get to enjoy a good mystery for a few hours before moving on with your vacation. Maybe that's why you're listening to today's episode. But before you move on to the rest of your day, take a moment to put yourself in John White's shoes. He knew the lost colonists. Many of them he had personally recruited for Raleigh's experiment in the New World. An experiment that went horribly wrong. And while White couldn't control the ocean or the politics of the time, he had to have felt some responsibility as the colony's governor and its representative between late 1587 and early 1590. Imagine having to go about your daily routine when your family and friends are on the other side of the Atlantic, not knowing if they're dead or alive. White must have felt a mix of emotions in 1590. Wariness of the Hopewell's crew, since a pirate was largely responsible for the colonists' predicament. Anxiety at his impending fifth journey to the New World across the sea, crawling with enemy Spaniards. But most of all, an overwhelming sense of relief at the chance to finally get closure on what had happened to his fellow colonists. Now imagine arriving at Roanoke Island and finding next to nothing. No colonists. No way to communicate with them. No closure. Sure, White had his theories, but theories aren't answers. That's the creepiest thing about Roanoke, after all. The not knowing. Even though we may never get those answers, we're lucky. Unlike John White, we don't have to live the rest of our lives haunted by the ghosts who might not even be dead, always asking the same question. What happened? This episode of A Dark Memory was researched and written by Tess Redman and produced by me, Edwin Covarrubias.